Londres.
The rise of what we still call the developing world is the central economic fact of our era. You know, when we were at school, we would have those maps of the world on the wall of the geography classroom. And the maps would show Europe bang in the middle. And that was, by the way, slightly artificial. You had to shift the equator so as to give Europe an artificial centrality. But at the backs of our mind, we still think that's how it is. The world has moved on. Just as the 18th century saw a shift in the economic center of the globe from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, so our age has seen a shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, how are we going to deal with the world's change, with the West's relative economic decline? Shortly after launching the Stay in the EU campaign, the former TV presenter June Sarpong wrote an article where she said she had come to the conclusion that we were better off in the EU after living in the US for 8 years and seeing the relative decline of that country vis-à-vis developing economies. Well, of course, she's quite right that developing countries are outgrowing the US. Here's a chart or a line showing what's happened to world GDP in percentages, what's happened to the US, and what's happened to the developing countries in Asia. So she's right that Asia is overtaking the US. But now let's add the European Union. You see that we have a much worse problem than the United States has. Between 1980 and 2020, the US will see a decline in its share of the world economy from 22% to 15%. But the European Union over the same period will see a decline from 30% to 15%. So this is not just about rising Asia. What is Europe getting wrong? Well, I think we all know that. The social model is wrong, the economic model is unsustainable, we have too few people working for too short a time, we have a record number of pensioners, the demographics are not great, and we've decided to exacerbate those underlying problems, it's very clear now, by sacrificing economic growth to the political goal of keeping the euro intact. That's now going to be the dominant theme in Europe for the next 10 or 15 years. While India and China and Brazil and Indonesia get on with making things and selling things, the leaders of Europe are going to be fretting about how to keep the euro together. Now that's their tragedy, but it doesn't have to be Britain's. We are in a different situation economically because we are the only country in Europe, not just the only EU member, but the only country in the EU or EFTA that sells a higher percentage of our exports outside the EU than to the other member states. We have options that otherwise we might not have. Now, in a recent Ici Londres, I quoted from this graph, which comes from the ONS, and I've been criticised by some supporters of the EU for misleading you. I should have made clear that this ONS graph shows our exports of goods, not of goods and services. And I hold my hands up, I apologise if that was not clear. But let's look at what the combined total of our goods and services exports is. If we look at what's happening in terms of our sales to the EU and our sales to the rest of the world, you see it's pretty much the same picture. It's not just that we sell more to the rest of the world than we do to the EU. It's not just that we have a surplus with the rest of the world, which only partly offsets our deficit with the EU. It's the trend of these things. Where are we going to be 20 years from now, 30 years from now? What tiny, dwindled, diminished rump of our trade will still be with the elderly, creaking, sclerotic economies at the western tip of the Eurasian landmass? It's going to seem bizarre to future generations that we were even having this conversation about whether to merge our political institutions into those of the European Union for the sake of what by then will be an almost insignificant share of our overall commerce. It's time to raise our eyes to more distant horizons and to rediscover our global vocation.